These pretty much invisible, unaccountable organisations have such huge influence over our political system.
These are people who have a lot of access to politicians.
They can simulate public support very easily with relatively a handful of supporters.
I think they are very authoritarian.
And these are people that will go on any show at any hour of the day.
They are anti-civil liberties.
They are massively influential.
They are absolutely looking out for the 1%, not the 99%.
Right at the heart of Westminster is this collection of right-wing think tanks that have influenced our politics for decades. I'm Eliza and I work for the Good Law Project, and we've been shining a light on these institutions and the fact that they do not disclose their donors. The Global Warming Policy Foundation, the Taxpayers Alliance and the Institute of Economic Affairs are just some of the groups that are based in and around 55 Tufton Street. They promote free market ideas such as drilling for more oil, deregulating the smoking industry and privatising the NHS. And more recently, Rishi announced his rollback on green pledges using language and ideas that we've been tracking from these groups. Okay, so the questions remain: who are Tufton Street and what exactly do they stand for? I'm going to start at the best place, which is the journalist Peter Gagan, who literally wrote the book on them.
Tufton Street essentially are lobbying organisations, and lobbying organisations for corporations and often for specific corporate interests. But the really big problem from a Democrat's point of view is that we don't know who exactly they're lobbying for because they don't declare where their money comes from.
What is the IEA? I don't get it. What do you do?
We're a think tank.
Even go there. No, I'd love to.
We're a free market think tank.
And who pays you then? Who funds you?
We're paid funded by all sorts of individuals.
We protect the privacy of our donors because places like the Byline Times would go after them.
I would like to actually talk about the policy matters at hand because I actually would like to talk about the way in which people in this country are suffering.
And on whose behalf are you talking?
These are not, in some respects, tremendously well-funded organisations. Most of them have an annual turnover of a couple of £1 million. It's a lot of money in some respects, but for the amount of influence, it's hugely outsized by the influence that these people have.
And so how much power do they actually have? What are we talking about here?
Liz Truss, for years, every Monday, went around to have lunch at the IEA. We didn't hear anything about that. That wasn't publicly disclosed in what she spoke about. Even though she was a minister, it wasn't recorded, but that was the case. And under Liz Truss, we saw graduates of Tufton Street, so many people with senior positions in Tufton Street, then in government. And we saw her enact policies that came straight out of Tufton Street. And in many ways, Liz Truss shows how a tiny amount of dark money can have so much influence. And just because Truss is gone doesn't mean Tufton Street's influence is totally gone. As we saw with Rishi Sunak and Net Zero, he rolled back policies in ways that were really being pushed for by Tufton Street.
And has there been this level of influence in previous governments, like David Cameron, Gordon Brown? Why does it feel so sort of concentrated now?
The street is significant. It's very close to Westminster. It's very close to the heart of Westminster. It's a 5-minute walk from Westminster. So these are people who have a lot of access to politicians. They are often in the same world, particularly with the Conservative Party, sometimes with Labour too, historically. Similarly, the media side of it, which is huge. I think people sometimes forget how important the media side is of it. In one of their recent company accounts, the IEA, I do read their company accounts for my sins. They talk about having, I think, like over 2,000 media appearances in the previous year. These are huge amounts of media appearances, and that's really important.
Let's get the thoughts of the director of Net Zero Watch, that's Benny Pizer.
And head of the British think tank, the Global Warming Policy Foundation.
I'm delighted to say now I'm joined by Harry Wilkinson.
He's head of policy for Net Zero Watch.
And Andy Mayer is here as an energy analyst
and chief operating officer
at the Institute of Economic Affairs.
They're able to pass off as being non-partisan, but actually they're coming from very, very specific ideological positions and being funded by very specific people. Framing is so important around news stories. And climate is one of those stories in particular where who's being heard and whose narrative is leading the agenda is so important.
At Good Law Project, we post our net zero and our climate change content on our social media channels, and part of my job is to go in and review the comments, have a look at the general conversation and how people are receiving it. What never fails to interest me is the fact that we have an overwhelming amount of comments that are essentially denying climate change. Obviously there is another camp, which are people that are genuinely concerned with the climate, but actually even within those groups there is this conversation rising about what is the urgency around climate action. There was a point in recent history where I felt like a lot of people were in general agreement about climate change is pretty bad, we should try and reverse it. And I'm really curious to see where this is coming from. Is this misinformation? Is this disinformation? And why? So on social media, we get this real sense that people are sceptical about the climate crisis. But has that trickled down to the everyday person? To find out, I've come to Didcot, which is a town in Oxfordshire, which back in 2017 was voted the most normal English town. It has a complete mixture of communities and age groups. So let's find out what they think. The first question is, how severe do you think the climate crisis is?
Very severe and needs to be taken seriously.
Decently bad, definitely overshot. Like, too many people say it's a lot higher than it actually is. It's not really.
We need to do something about it now.
I think it's very bad at the moment, and it's not getting any better, really.
Oh, it's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying, yeah, very severe.
And how do you feel like it's perceived in the media?
I think the way that it's represented in the media is frequently that it's minimalised.
They make it seem like it's death's door, don't they? Like literally, if we don't stop today, it's going to end. It's like, no, if we disappeared today, nothing would change.
So it's by and by becoming one of the main or usual things to talk about. Yeah.
So it's always got diluted just because it's one of those topics.
That's it.
If it is focused on at all, it's focused on really little issues, and it's polarised into disputes like the recent one we've seen, you know, this kind of war on motorists and all the rest of it.
I think there's some good work drawing it to our attention. I think the BBC is very good. There's just a lot of denial. I mean, the people who don't like the impact of bad coverage, for whatever reason, they like to shout, don't they?
I want us to be prosperous and warm, not poor and cold.
I reckon the net zero target acts as an asphyxiating straitjacket.
No, it's energy security or net zero. It can't be both.
The damning surveyors condemn politicians claiming they've no understanding of the pain policies like net zero would inflict on the public.
Who is actually asking in government whether net zero is helping or hindering the NHS?
That they're using this as a way of just making money off the UK public.
The government is backing away from their unpopular green policies.
Is net zero economic suicide?
A lot of the climate skeptic messaging that we've been seeing shares similarities with the material that's promoted by these Tufton Street groups. We've been investigating them for a while, and we commissioned an ethical data science company, Signify, to find out just how much they're influencing the climate change debate.
So we started by looking at the things that Tufton Street was very prolific in talking about, so the topics that they return to again and again. There are all kinds of different narratives that have been tested over the last 5 years, ranging from, you know, there's a volcano under the Antarctic that's causing the ice shelf to melt, to it was hotter in Roman times in Europe than it is now, and climate change is just a natural cycle. And the one that's really worked, which is net zero, is going to hit those people who can afford it the least, the hardest.
One thing I really want to wrap my head around is this idea of it being a network of think tanks. How do they all work together to plant these arguments?
Within Tufton Street, the different parts play different roles. Net Zero Watch publishes stuff every day and sees what works. You know, the Global Warming Policy Foundation is a slower moving organisation that publishes kind of white papers and think pieces. And then the IEA is essentially somewhere where you get talking heads to go on TV.
Was there any patterns that surprised you that you found?
It's really remarkable to see a story get picked up by Net Zero Watch and then be in the Sun within a month, and then to see national newspapers falling in behind it. I don't think people within the Tufton Street ecosystem really care about public opinion. The opposite is true of groups that Tufton Street is exerting influence on. So the media really cares how public opinion is changing. And the other audience that is extremely pliable is politicians.
So that leads on quite well to my next question, which was, how does the operation of Tufton Street network of think tanks operate differently from all of the other think tanks?
One of the things that's unique about them is they're operating in a social media environment. So they're operating in an environment where they can appear to be much more vocal and important than they actually are. And I think another thing that's unusual about Tufton Street as a specific group is how much they've captured the castle. They are massively influential. It's highly unusual to see any kind of lobby group get to this level of influence.
We know that the anti-net zero narrative is influencing our media and influencing our politics, but just how much? I've come to Parliament today to interview Caroline Lucas, who is the former leader of the Green Party, to find out more. From our research, we can see that Tufton Street think tanks are actively trying to cast doubt over our need for reaching net zero. We're focused on climate change, and I know you've been really vocal about that. You know, you've campaigned outside 55 Tufton Street with climate crisis campaigners. Why so vocal? What's that need?
We know that they have hundreds of meetings with ministers. We know that shortly afterwards policies get watered down, and you know, the whole debate around climate change gets changed. Really trying to kick back against that, I think, is something that absolutely needs to be exposed.
What does that look like in Parliament? How have you experienced it? What have you heard? What have you seen? And how is it seeping its way into Parliament?
Just since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they've had over 200 meetings with ministers. It doesn't take a genius to add up that there is a level of access and influence here that at the very least is questionable and should be on the public record and should be much more transparently known about, and at the worst looks like a really unjustifiable level of influence on our political system.
So there was a lot of sort of dialogue around the idea that by achieving net zero, we would push down our energy bills. But then somewhere along the way, that completely changed. And what do you say to that? Why has that happened?
Well, I think it's a deeply cynical, opportunistic way of responding to essentially the big geopolitics around this, which was, of course, the invasion. The irony is that it was precisely our dependence on fossil fuels and the fact that fossil fuel prices were going up as a result of the invasion. That is what got our fuel bills going up. And so the answer to that is to get off fossil fuels as quickly as possible.
Do you think that Rishi Sunak and his government are in collusion with these Tufton Street think tanks?
I think they are certainly on the same page. And that is what I think we're seeing from Rishi Sunak. For the Prime Minister of this country to be listening to the voices of Tufton Street and rolling back on climate measures is just the height of irresponsibility. It is just so reckless.
We've spoken to a lot of people about Tufton Street, but I wanted to hear their side of the story. So I reached out to them over email. Okay, and that is sent. Let's just hope that someone comes back to me now. Spoiler alert, none of them got back to me. So I tried giving them a ring.
I'm very sorry, but there's nobody available to take your call at the moment. The person at extension is unavailable.
That's 3 tries and not got through to anybody. Hello? Oh. Is Wednesday the new Friday? What's going on?
This is the Vodafone voicemail service.
So, despite sending loads of emails and leaving voicemails for these networks at Tufton Street, nobody got back to me. However, I did get an opportunity to speak to someone who's of that world and knows it very well, but it was off camera and I'm unfortunately not going to be able to share it with you. However, a lot of what they told me felt like it countered a lot of the information that I found out during the making of this documentary. So in order to find out how much truth is in it, I'm going to speak to the journalist who spoke to at the beginning, Peter Gagan, who has been researching these organisations for years. Hi Peter, thanks for chatting to me today. So I suppose kicking off, one of the main things that has really stuck out to me was he basically talked about this idea that the sort of nefarious nature of Tufton Street has been really overblown, and that actually what they are is just a bunch of data enthusiasts that are just following the data, following the research. Funding was kind of a non-issue. Do we think that the spotlight on them is a bit harsh?
I think there should be more of a spotlight on them, frankly. What you've seen is a very small number of groups do not declare where their donors come from, exerting a massively outsized influence on our politics over recent years. It's less about specific policies and much more about general worldviews that we don't know, again, who's actually funding this. And if there was a marketplace for ideas, which is a phrase that's often used by these groups, why don't they go out into that marketplace? And we have seen these groups exert far more influence over the last I would say 8 years, especially since the Brexit referendum, than they had at any time since Margaret Thatcher. Vilifying people who look upon them as conspiracy theorists, I think we missed the mark.
So you mentioned Brexit there and a lot of the power they had there. The person that I spoke to talked about this idea that the power that Tufton Street network has had and the influence has dropped dramatically since Brexit, and with the pandemic they started working from home and a lot of that influence has shifted over to GB News. I thought that was a really interesting idea. Would you agree with that?
I think it depends what you mean by power. This is kind of a hydra. It's all of these connected people with kind of common interests. What we did see, I don't buy the pandemic argument, we did see in Liz Truss the hypothesis of the Tufton Street worldview. That was what her mini budget was, absolutely expressly. Unfortunately, when it hit reality, it exploded. And I think it'll be interesting to see what extent they're able to maintain influence. And they've shown for a long time that they can get a hell of a lot of media pick up on media headlines, and that is often a powerful form of influence. The likes of GB News, I think, will become very influential almost no matter what happens.
What feels like it's the next step for Tufton Street?
I've no doubt some of them will be hoping already to court Labour MPs. The Global Warming Policy Foundation, which has been at Tufton Street for years, has a long history of climate denial. They've already got one Labour MP have for a long time on their board, Graham Stringer. There's already kind of some historical links there between some sections. Like in some ways, it is actually quite obvious what's going on. Too long, too many people just haven't wanted to sit down and name it and go, this is about small numbers of rich people with quite extremist ideologies being able to push messages very successfully into the public discourse and actually more laterally into government policy.
Even under a Labour government, it looks like these think tanks and their influence are here to stay. But after speaking to Joe and Peter, they seem to think that public opinion of Tufton Street and these think tanks isn't such a big deal. The problem is the influence that they have on media and politicians. And they've had a lot of success in the last 14 years with getting their messages out, which isn't necessarily a problem. It's important that everybody has a different perspective, and that's kind of part of the political diversity. The problem here is funding and the fact they do not disclose their donors. And when we asked people about whether they should share who funds them, they all agreed they should.
Funding's obviously crucial, yeah, because if it's funding by business, or then who knows what sort of messages are getting passed on to government.
I think it should be open to check, but I don't think there is a need for them to, like, I don't know, create a billboard saying who it is.
Oh, certainly they should, and I know they're not, yes.
Yes, most definitely.
Yes.
And why do you think that?
It seems to me that there's no reason why that shouldn't be subject to the same sort of freedom of information that other information is subject to.
A lack of donor transparency raises significant questions about whether public opinion is being manipulated to serve the interests of the elite few rather than the broader population. So this makes us have to be extra wary about the content that they put out, whether it be about the climate, as we've seen, or other issues. So it's really important that we're even more cautious and even more conscious about the content that we consume. And we will be keeping a close eye on these think tanks and monitoring the influence that they have very, very closely.